Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Under the Influence, Stopping Disinformation on and Offline. From the packed room, I can see that everyone agrees with me. This is a particularly timely topic. I have to confess, I think we might be overselling ourselves by talking about stopping disinformation on and offline. It might be, how do we live in this world where disinformation is as rife as it is? We have a phenomenal panel today and not nearly enough time to tackle this topic. So I'm not going to speak much, but really just to say, yesterday I think there were a number of conversations already circling around these discussions and talking a lot about a lot of the challenges that we're seeing. And so one of the things we really want to challenge the panel today is to think about solutions, and think about solutions particularly in an environment when not only do we have too much disinformation, we don't have trust. We don't have enough trust. We're living in a time of a real deficit of trust in the institutions that may be at the forefront of countering disinformation in all of our societies. So we have a really wonderful range of perspectives on the panel, from sort of policy think tanks to media to government and multilateral systems. So I'm really looking forward to diving straight in. I may ask Mariana for you to kick off. Mariana Campos is the Director General of Mexico Evalua. So Mariana, I wonder if you just might want to reflect a bit on some of the challenges that you're seeing in Mexico, but really, where are you seeing some of the solutions, particularly in this difficult environment?
Thank you so much, Meredith. Hello to everyone. I'm very happy to be here at the Paris Peace Forum and to have a chance to speak to you on such an important topic. I think it's a fantastic panel, and this is a very important topic because, you know, misinformation and distrust is really a threat to our democracies, is really a threat to public opinion and the trust among different actors in society. So in Mexico, well, disinformation, online and offline, is a reality, and it's becoming a real problem. And I believe that the challenge is everywhere. Actually, Freedom House has documented one of the lowest rates in free press that we have been observing in 13, 15 years. And so it's a reality everywhere, but the challenge is of different measures also everywhere. In Mexico, for example, I think it's a very big challenge that unfortunately the government is part of building the disinformation and to build the distrust. For example, Mexico has been one of the most, in my opinion, bad managed countries while COVID going on, and the government unfortunately was not helping with good information on how to, make sure people can stop help themselves to not get infected and things like that. But what is going on also is that during our current government, there's a press conference every day where there's a section that is called "Who is in the Lies of the Week?" And the government builds this trust towards journalism and some journalists and also some NGOs that work providing analysis in the public opinion and evaluation on the government's policies. So when the government is not helping to build independent and quality, promoting quality independent journalism, the challenge can be bigger. But I have to say that this distrust is occurring among every actor. It's towards the government, it's towards the media, it's towards the NGOs, and among social actors. This puts a big challenge because we have to change the way we are working in our data that we put in the outlets. In Mexico Evalua, we have been we have to be more careful in order to double check what you are actually providing to the public, and also the way you build the narratives. You have to be extra careful not to be, I'm not talking about misinforming, because we do not do misinformation, we do fact checking, but not to be labeled as somebody trying to polarize the discussion. So we have to reach, I think, different audiences. We have to also try to build strategies to reach, of course, graded audiences. And I think that think tanks, as Mexico Evalúa, should focus on three things. First of all, to not only do the fact-checking, but also help programs, educational programs, to educate the public. Public should, especially the youth, are vulnerable to not consulting more than one source of information, and they are very active in the social media. So educating the youth is very important in order that they consult more than one source of information before reaching conclusions and sharing content in the social media. We also need to talk about the policy recommendations, which is not, they are not intended to build like a huge solution that will solve this problem from the bottom, from the up to the bottom. This is a problem that needs to be addressed from different perspectives and different roles. The government should promote independent and quality journalism. Technology companies should invest in technology in order to detect fake news and disinformation. They have to do the investments. The media also has to rely on quality journalism and should not legitimate misinformation or fake news, and should talk about it. And whenever there is misinformation and fake news, they need to recognize that immediately. It also is very important that governments do not extra-regulate or promote the censorship. And that's the very fine balance, because we've seen in other countries that they might be monitoring tools of social media and to control the contents, and this entails a risk of legitimizing authoritarian regimes or leaders. So I think that's a very careful limit between what can be regulated or not. In my opinion, we shouldn't be into regulation of these kind of things. We should be promoting best practices.
Great. Mariana, thank you. And I think you're already speaking to this sort of continuum of thinking about the production of disinformation, the consumption, and the dissemination, and sort of how that runs through. Omar Ben-Jacob, if I can turn over to you, cyber and disinformation journalist from Haaretz. And I think it would be great to hear your reflections on Mariana's points, but also on how you're seeing this as a journalist, and particularly in situations of real division and conflict in this moment.
Yeah, so it's an honor to be here, and it's also fun again to be the only person not in a suit on the panel, which I appreciate as a status. I'm an investigative reporter, and my kind of entry into the space of disinformation, I think it's a good way to also touch on some of your points, is also as an Israeli who's coming to you now from kind of the backdrop of a crazy conflict that I'm not going to talk about, but I will address a bit how it's also playing out in terms of disinformation, which I think, or the spectrum between disinformation and misinformation, I think we're all experiencing. But also as a reporter who, together with a French NGO who you maybe know called Forbidden Stories, looked into disinformation as part of a very large group of journalists last year in a very big investigation that involved me and two other reporters going undercover. So also Frédéric Métézeau from Radio France and also Gourmet Guido from my newspaper. And the reason we went undercover to try to kind of penetrate into what you can think of as actual disinformation providers is because the reality is that we know very little about disinformation post-2016 because of organizations like Facebook and Twitter who have actually kind of blocked our ability and civil society's ability to research this in a substantial way. So if I were to randomly poll this room, most of you would think disinformation, I would assume, comes predominantly from states and not from private actors. Or maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. Maybe it's also a rhetorical point. But it comes from private actors who also sell it not just to states. So it's not just this kind of what maybe a lot of people have heard also about, like Francophone Africa, where you have organizations like Wagner, these semi-state organizations, right? So I'm talking about actually companies, and there's Israeli companies that do this. There's very interesting research published yesterday by LinkedIn and Microsoft about how Black Cube was using LinkedIn to record left-wing critics of the regime in Hungary and then leak these videos. And it's a very interesting example of kind of the spectrum between disinformation as a service, which is the kind of term that I'm trying to make the thing, disinformation as a service, and cyber. And I think there's this very big spectrum that people don't fully understand or is not yet clear of how disinformation is actually provided in a very large bundle of services. Now let's circle back to the Israeli example because I think it's an interesting way to talk about it. When we were doing this undercover investigation, one of the reasons Forbidden Stories wanted us to investigate disinformation is because disinformation disproportionately targets journalists. And the reason for, especially female journalists, but the reason for that at a broader level is because the real goal of misinformation or disinformation is to undermine trust. So that is the actual product that you are providing. You're not providing necessarily a specific narrative. You're providing a reality in which it's almost impossible to build real significant trust. When I was undercover and I met this crazy person of disinformation or this crazy agent of disinformation, he told me, you know, I don't deal in fake news. I deal in credibility. What we do is we build credibility and then we destroy it, or then we manipulate it. But without credibility, you can't manipulate. So you have to trust me so I can fool you. Now let's fast forward to October 7th. October 7th breaks out, and we have a perfect storm of disinformation. Elon Musk has rolled back everything that we have seen put in place since 2018, which wasn't that good anyway, but okay. But they've rolled that back down, and you also have two sides with two very different strategies of I would say information warfare. And Hamas has been very, very smart in using what you can think of as the kind of social media to just flood the world with materials. And the ability to flood the world with raw materials, I would juxtapose that to the Israeli very kind of polished attempt to put out a very coherent narrative, or what we could call hasbara, so Israeli public diplomacy. And this very kind of PR looking, the general standing and explaining things, like no one believes that. That's the point. And I think what's so interesting is that, and this I'll finish with this, is that again, the product of this information is lack of trust. And I think what we're seeing now in this I don't want to call it Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but perhaps this Netanyahu-Hamas conflict, what we're seeing is how when it metastasizes, when it becomes a global event, one of the first victims is facts. So if you're pro-Palestinian, you have to deny that people from my country were slaughtered on October 7th. And if you're pro-Israeli, you have to deny the fact that people are being murdered in Gaza right now. And there's simply no reason for that dichotomy to exist. Like, it's genuinely beyond me why you can't say, I think Hamas is a terrible organization, and I think it's terrible that people were slaughtered or kidnapped, and it's also terrible the response that the terrible government of Israel is that. And the fact that so many people believe that to be able to actually support the side, you have to deny facts, and you have to undermine the trust. Forget about Netanyahu that no one trusts. The trust in me, yeah? Haaretz is a very good newspaper. We get tons of trouble with our government for doing good reporting, seriously. But within the wider world, no one trusts us now because we're Israeli. Why? Why? You should trust us because we're a good newspaper. It doesn't matter. Like the same way, and this will be my last point, I'm sorry. The same way that I think journalists, generally, I feel very kind of hugged and supported by my journalistic community because there's no need to deny facts. So.
Amar, thank you so much. And I think this maybe follows on really nicely to Bertrand Levent from the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, because I think there's this bigger question also of when you do break down this trust, how do you build it back? How do you reach marginalized communities that are being impacted by disinformation? How do you bring their experiences back? How do you bring them back into the fold? And how do you bring new voices into that context? So, Bertrand.
Merci Meredith. Je vais m'exprimer en français.
Thank you, Meredith. I'm going to be speaking French because I work for the International Organization of Francophonie, and I'm delighted to be here at the Paris Peace Forum to present this flagship program, which is one of the solutions, and you can see them in the booths on the ground floor. Now, to answer Meredith's question and to pick up on what's been said on the way disinformation is produced and spread, we could see what's involved and how certain communities want to restore trust. Now, I work in all the French-speaking world, and we're particularly interested in Africa and Middle East and North Africa, and countries in crisis situation, and there's a real temptation for disinformation there. And we work on the question of producing disinformation so that we can find answers in the French-speaking world and how we can regulate digital platforms, for example. I think this is an important point. When you talk about producing fake news, you have to see how the platforms are responsible for producing and spreading such fake news and hatred, hate speech. So there can be global responses, but if you come back to the local level, I think it's important to step up local responses to combat disinformation, and that's what our association is trying to do in different parts of the French-speaking world. We have 3 levels of approach. First, you have to check the facts, and to do that locally and in local languages, because you get disinformation being spread in local languages, and so fact-checkers need to be the ones who check on this. They're the ones who understand the language, and they also understand the background and the political context which is around the fake news. And then there's the question of taking action to stop such information, such fake news being spread. We have to make sure that after the facts are checked, that media practices are looked at, again, in a local context. And for the OIF member countries, and in particularly in French-speaking Africa, radio plays a key role in spreading content and providing access to information and news, and also for reaching rural communities. And so there are a number of initiatives which have been put into place and which we've supported in a number of French-speaking countries in Africa. And they work on fact-checking, and then they work through radios, in particular community-based radios, so that the content can be spread in local languages to the relevant communities. I'd also like to pick up on what Mariana said about the importance of education. It's obviously important. And we can see that local radios are also involved in media literacy and media education, and it's important to step that up. And of course, it's important to check the facts. And you need to work on better regulation and responsibility for all the players involved, and this includes the players on digital platforms, but you also need to have proper education in media, for proper media literacy, and working not just with civil society but also with governments, because this is advocacy which we really need to step up so that we have media education programs, particularly for the younger generation, but not just the younger generation, so that people can develop a critical mind when they see information and news and are aware of the dangers and risks they have when they look at what's on their screens, and thus restrict the spread of disinformation
your final point,
online.
It really is also creating the resilience for people who have to live in this environment. I think we all know disinformation existed before the internet and will exist long after. And I think thank you also for raising the power of radio in in these areas, which has also been a tool for disinformation in the past and can be a real tool for education and dissemination in these spaces. So Ralph Best, Director General for Culture and Communications from the German Federal Foreign Office, you have the opportunity, speaking last on this panel, also to respond to some of the things that you've heard from your colleagues as well. But I wonder if you can also just reflect a little bit on how you've also seen regulation potentially playing in to this. Do you see this as something, can we regulate our way out of this? What are some of the other solutions that you're seeing through the reach of the German government that you see having some real impact?
Merci. Bien que je respecte l'idée de la francophonie.
Thank you. Of course, I have great respect for French-speaking countries and Francophonie, but I speak English.
You might say a few words about that, because you're not only a very good moderator, but you know quite a bit about resilience, as we learned during our conversations beforehand. I'm very happy to try to do that together with responding to what you said. I think in this whole debate and the whole, like, the battle of narratives, of information and disinformation, it's very difficult to conceive of effective ways of regulation. Plus, if a government steps in, I used to be a journalist before I became a diplomat, if a government steps in and says, for the sake of truth, we're going to regulate, that really puts you in a tight spot and doesn't really increase your credibility. Yeah, governments should be very careful about that. And that already opens up the arena where we're working in as a government. We're not like working in Germany, but abroad as a foreign ministry, of course. And what we try to do is try to identify how can we operate. And we think that transparency and quality are very important means of doing that. And to obtain something that comes close to credibility. We know that as a government, people shouldn't really trust us in the first place. We know that they don't. Okay, how do we deal with that? We want to, and we think that you can't really try to stop disinformation. It's going to happen. It's like a playing of whack-a-mole. Like, you run after a mole, but it's going to pop up somewhere else. You're always behind it. So what do you do if they flood the zone with shit, as Steve Bannon said? How do you react to that? You can't say, like, we flood the zone with truth. You can think that, but you don't really have to think that anybody believes you. So, so what to do? Like, be open about what you do. And be transparent in a way. So we try to instruct our ambassadors, and we think our ambassadors around the world are our single best communicators, to be open, to be clear about their objectives and where they stand, and maybe try to establish a little bit of credibility by that means, by saying, okay, this is what we want, this is what we achieve, this is what we deem false, this is what we deem appropriate. For instance, in this very difficult situation now after the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, it's totally clear that a country as Germany, with our history and our responsibilities, stands by Israel and will be the last country to leave you. This puts us in a very difficult position in very many Arab countries, but not only in Arab countries. And I tell my ambassadors, okay, I know that you have problems now, but stay your course. Say who we are, and this is the moment of truth for us as well, where we say who we are. And if people are surprised, ask yourself, should you have been clearer beforehand? If people are surprised about our position, we all might have done a better job explaining who Germany is. So try to be open about that, and I think that gives you a chance to establish a certain credibility. The other thing is quality. That's not only about our ambassadors, who are our most important communicators, but they are people and they have to establish these relations. And I think that's something that also belongs to the issue that journalists have. Sometimes the paper or the media is not credible, but maybe one journalist. Maybe because people know Omar is a decent journalist, they will trust him or her colleague or whatever. And that's one thing. The other thing is the quality thing. We try to finance and support initiatives, media sometimes, that do stuff that helps building resilience or building or giving information. For instance, we have the Deutsche Welle, which is state financed but editorially independent, a national news outlet that works around the globe. We support them and other agencies providing and disseminating content, news content, for instance, in countries in Africa, where there is a competition of information, where we see that Xinhua and Russia Today disseminate their information, their stuff, sometimes even pay for that. And we try just to give radio stations, news outlets, access to German-made information that we deem qualitatively good, and say, you have an alternative source of information, why not use it? That's the ways that we try to deal with it.
Ralph, thank you. I want to just maybe pose one question. I want to make sure we do have some time for questions from the audience. And just thinking about this, you sort of said competition of information, and I think it crystallizes the question that I wanted to pose, which is, are we losing the competition of information? And so often disinformation has an advantage because it is free from fact, and it focuses on fear. And these things can be deeply, deeply mobilizing, and coming back at that with, but here are the facts, and here's a technical brief with some information about all of the evidence and well footnoted and well researched, doesn't actually respond to the mobilizing energy that the disinformation has been designed to elicit from the populations. So I guess the question that I would have maybe for the panelists to reflect on is, how do we begin to win back that information competition? How do we shift that and really challenge ourselves to be better? It can be evidence-driven, but are we speaking in the right way to the right targeted audiences to make that difference? Mariana, do you want to start?
Yes, I think that there's something key in the way we approach the information we decide to, in the case of Mexico Evalúa, to disclose. And we cannot deny facts. I think that you said something very, very key in this aspect. We cannot deny the facts, and if we explain the different facts, how like you said, we recognize that what has happened in Israel is terrible, but also what is going on in Gaza is also terrible. So if you recognize both facts, maybe you can connect with the different audiences. And if you quit to recognize that, then you lose the battle, because automatically you just go to one side and to one part of it. So I think that's the different approach that you can compromise yourself and your organization to do. And it's not easy, because sometimes recognizing both facts can take you to some hate in the social media. But you have to be strong to confront that. I would like to say also something that is very important, because if we don't recognize a fact, we might contribute to the lack of truth, and the lack of truth, first of all, can enhance a lack of freedom. Freedom comes from when you recognize that you can actually say to a government, this is not true, and these are the facts. If you cannot do that, then you cannot evaluate a government, and nothing can be said. So you lose freedom. So that's such the stance of these positions, and I think that the way to connect is to recognize both sides or three sides of the story by recognizing the facts.
Thanks. Umber, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd love to jump on. I think it's a really, really smart point. And I think when we were publishing all the Team Jorge and the Percepto and all these investigations, we discovered that a lot of this stuff is actually not illegal. And I think that's actually okay. Like, I don't think we should live in a world in which lying is illegal. That would be a terrible world to live in. And I think our solution, in that sense, I'm very conservative. I think the solutions I want to offer actually go back to kind of what you were talking about. And I think in that sense, what we're missing is digital enlightenment. It sounds very corny, but I think it's very true, because I think I think in that sense, it's very hard to be fact checkers. But I think you want to create frameworks in which people can deploy skepticism and rational thought, because turns out that's actually the best solution. Like, you look at what is the online platform that is the best at fighting disinformation? Wikipedia. Why? Because they don't have any debate about truth. They have a process of due diligence of sources. You need a source. That's it. doesn't need to be a good source. You just need a source. And it turns out that if you have a source, and if someone else asks you to show it, that does away with literally 90% of like BS, right? And this kind of comes back to, I think, the bigger point, which we didn't talk about yet, but AI and this kind of wider issues of, I think, how technology and new technologies can scale disinformation. And that is the fact that the biggest issue, or the way I'd like to think about it, the biggest issue with disinformation is that it's actually being pushed out by non-human agents. So if you think about bots and avatars, they're the ones who are lying. I don't lie, not because I'm a great person, because it will get me fired and get me sued. And turns out that's a really good motivation, not for lying. I want to stay, I want a career, and I want to be able to show my face in public. Wow, like let's deploy that at a mass scale. Let's make sure that people who don't have faces and names are not allowed to publish. Now, this will require us to do something that for some reason we haven't been able to do, which is regulate social media as media, one. Two, it should allow us to say quite simple and quite interesting things about AI. If you're not a human, please do not participate in my political debate. Because and this is my last line, I don't think this information should be illegal. Because it's not a legal issue, it's a human rights issue. If my voice, I don't have free speech, if my speech is being diluted by avatars online, my politics becomes meaningless, right? And in Israel, we see this also in many places. Far right or very racist populists win because their voices is being normalized, not actually by your aunt. Your aunt thinks it's okay to believe this because she read it in 15 WhatsApp groups. But that's the whole point. Like the normalization of shameful opinions is done by non-human actors. Lies are pushed out by non-human actors. And this is the issue. So we need digital humanism and we need digital enlightenment. And that is a completely educational project.
And presumably there are humans behind the bots several layers back who need to be regulated in those.
Yes,
spaces,
of course.
right? Yeah, absolutely. There is someone behind the curtain.
Yes. It's not a mystery.
Bertrand, did you want to add?
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais rebondir justement et insister sur ce que.
I just wanted to bounce back on what Omer was saying. We might be naive, but I think it's very important to focus on freedom of expression, journalism, journalist's job, and plurality of expression. People have, the media have a responsibility to foster diversity of thoughts. And I think this is what's missing on social media right now. And this is one of the reasons why we are faced with an increasingly polar world. Freedom of speech, human rights is something that we defend everywhere we operate, with every government that we work with in my organization. And Meredith, to go back to what you were saying, is how important cooperation is. Mariana was talking about a multi-stakeholder approach. I think this is something that needs to be promoted worldwide. We need to be able to mobilize a wide range of stakeholders in order to combat disinformation, especially on digital platforms. We need to bring together platforms, governments, and the civil society. And this is something that also rings true at the local level. We need to promote cooperation locally between civil society organizations, media, regulators, data protection organizations, or election management organizations, because disinformation is particularly important during elections. I think we need to be able to play with all those stakeholders so that we act everywhere a direct or indirect response is needed in order to combat those initiatives that undermine information. So I think this is something that matters. This is something that the OIF has tried to work on. We have deployed expertise missions with governments who request such operations from us. We try to target the legal, the non-legal, the governmental, regulatory responses responses, and we always work with local partners as a way to find responses.
When you're really rooting this with local partners, they know how to talk to populations. There's a connection that's more contextually focused around how you're actually having those conversations. As a very analog example, during the period of the LRA in northern Uganda and parts of Sierra and South Sudan, the Fondation Hirondelle would bring the mothers of LRA fighters onto the radio late at night to simply talk to primarily their boys and try and convince them to come home. But it was a very direct, very emotional, very specific outreach to a group that had been targeted by an analog form of disinformation, which was the recruitment and forced recruitment campaigns of the LRA. But it would bring them back by using the local knowledge. It was all, of course, done in local language, and by harnessing the emotion. It was an emotional tie within the communities and driven by the communities. Ralph, maybe a last word, and then I'm going to open to the audience. Okay. I'm sure there are questions. I see one hand already. I see two, three. Okay. So what I may do is take a couple of questions and then circle back to the panel just so we can hear from a few of you. And if you can just be brief and to the point, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Guillaume Costa. I'm the CEO of Check First, which is a software company tracking the fight, helping the fight against disinformation through tracking its spread on platforms. I have a question for Ralph Bester. You almost dodged the question about regulation, saying it's tricky for governments to do so. At the same time, the European Union is trying to set an example for the world by putting together the Digital Services Act and putting the responsibility of staying in line on the platforms, which, thank you, Bertrand, for reminding us that platforms share a great deal of responsibility about that. Do you think the DSA is a good approach into putting that burden on the platforms, and should it serve as a source of inspiration for others in the world?
Merci. I saw a couple of other hands at the back, and then there's one at the front. So we'll take one more at the back, and then I've got a gentleman here at the front. Please.
Merci. Bonjour. Je suis Noël Tadeno.
Hello, my name is Noël Tadeno. I am the co-founder of Togo Check, one of the organizations that has been supported by the International Francophonie Organization. What we do is that we train through leisure. We work in Niger, and we train comedians in translating information, because we have realized that it is one thing to identify quality news, but it's another thing to be able to share, to disseminate this information. We know that a lot of people in our country do not have access to the internet, and this information is very much at stake when we talk about disinformation. So a lot is being said nowadays about artificial intelligence. How can we stop disinformation against the backdrop of a rising artificial intelligence?
Sorry, I have a question and a remark, a short question to Omer. And to all the... I'm Luca Dolat, formerly journalist in Germany. Hello, Ralph. Wie geht's? Do you advise us to continue using X, Twitter? I have a lot of problems in my personal views about that. Just
have you tried do not reply at x.com?
And a short remark, the word content contributes to blur the frontier between communication and information, and that's a big problem. That was
I want to give one more, the gentleman here, and then we'll go back to the panel for some.
Thank you. My name is Remy Mian. I'm a researcher at Sciences Po. I had a question for Omar as well. He seemed to suggest that one policy solution could be to require sourcing for social media posts, and I had two follow-ups on that. The first is, how would you determine whether a source is legitimate or not? Is there a risk of using disinformation as a source? And then my second question is, a lot of researchers will use social media to share their initial findings, or creators of knowledge will use social media before, to share their findings before it's peer reviewed or before it's published. I think that's actually one of the main positives of social media. So how do you, if you were to require sourcing for social media posts, how would you still keep it as a positive for knowledge generation? Thank you.
Great. Super. Thanks. Ralph, I'll maybe go to you first and give Omar a second to process your questions. Go.
Thank you. Yeah, I think governments should be cautious, but not that they shouldn't be active. And I think Digital Service Act is a good one, is a good example, and holding platforms responsibility and really challenging the question if they are media or not, as Omer hinted at, is a very important thing. There is a responsibility for those who disseminate like information, whatever, reproaches, disinformation, to be held responsible for that. We have national legislation also that limits like the freedom of speech, you might say. There are certain things you cannot disseminate in Germany, like Holocaust denial, incitement to, or like glorification of National Socialism and stuff like that. And I think we also should be very clear about incitement of violence in social media. So there is certainly scope and room and need for regulation, but as I said, like one government saying that I'm the arbiter of what is good and what is bad should be cautious. So I'm open for that. And I think what Omer said about the sources is something that we need to discuss. I like your idea about enlightenment in this age. It's still very valid point. Only hinting at the sources or providing the sources might not be sufficient. Saying like I have this from Russia Today may be important for judgment for some, but not for all. And so we are really in a very difficult process about that. But transparency about sources should certainly give more insight to people that can use it. And I also like the idea of putting the individual first as the source of knowledge, of information, because there is a certain need for any individual to be truthful in order to be respected. Yeah. And we shouldn't let people out of that, if that's a radio host or if it is a social media follower or actor.
I'll jump on. I really love the comment about from my German colleague about content. So I think content is one of the most vulgar words to be used in society today. I think it's really terrible word. It always reminds me of this Marxist concept of the abstraction of the concept of labor, right? So we now have an abstraction of the concept of content. And I think to explain how that manifests online and supports disinformation, I would say on Facebook and on Twitter, all links look the same. And this is actually a massive problem, because when me and you walk down the street, we know which magazines are shitty and which is the library, right, with the peer review stuff. You can just see it, right? So you might say, you might be relativistic and postmodern and say, you know, the academia also has its biases. And you'd be right, of course. But I think that for me is what digital enlightenment, or my kind of framework that I'm talking about, is, you know, it's so interesting. We're not striving for truth, we're striving for facts. And facts actually has a very clear definition. Facts is what fact makers, journalists, policy makers, people who has the right to publish in different contexts, put out. Does that mean we're right? No. That's for sure. But we've discovered that newspapers that require attribution are much better than newspapers that don't. For example, if you see a newspaper publishing report : then you get that this newspaper is now writing up some other newspaper's report. As opposed to someone who, you know, I love the New York Times style, according to 15 people with knowledge of the matter who have requested to stay anonymous due to the sensitivity of the issue, right? So you have this due diligence of explaining. And I think the more, I'm interested in seeing more due diligence. And for me, the model is Wikipedia and a web of trust. So if you look at the way you asked about scientists sharing their knowledge, like I think what happened in the preprint space, this idea that scientists publish preprints, is actually one of the most interesting models we have online for knowledge sharing, because in theory, scientists could be making up studies all day long and posting preprints, but they don't, right? They actually publish really good stuff. They're just pissed off that it takes 3 months to get published via peer review, but they want their study to be good. Why? Because it's under their name. And that's the point. We want I want to see us to migrate practices from the print and in a print world to the online space. And now to your question, how do we regulate this stuff? Because my position is anti-innovation. I don't think Facebook did anything new. So when Mark Zuckerberg says we sell ads, sir, you know that that's also what my publisher does. My publisher owns a newspaper that is 100 years old. They also sell ads, sir. So why is it that when I lie in the newspaper, I can face libel, but when I lie, when it happens on Like my publisher can get sued, but Zuckerberg can't. We don't need to enforce anything. Let's just enforce libel laws against this stuff. I don't think it will actually undermine free speech in a real way. I think that's a mute debate that is built around this innovation discourse. So it's, the reason we can't regulate social media is because they don't want to pay taxes, not because it's a free speech issue. Because they've convinced us they sell something new. They sell ads, sir. So does the Salzburg family for the New York Times, yeah? So.
Omar, thank you. We've only got a minute left, and so I just want to give an opportunity if either Mariana or Bertrand want a last final 2-second word before we close out. Bertrand, did you want to speak on the...
Juste pour rebondir sur ce
Question?
débat sur les sources, je pense qu'il est important.
I'd like to come back to the question of sources. We talked about platforms, and obviously lying is covered by freedom of expression, unlike hate speech or denial of Nazism or cases like that. But I don't think we should make disinformation a criminal offense. That would be counterproductive. But I think that platforms should recognize reference media recognized locally, and we've got the Francophone initiatives against disinformation, and there are around 100 initiatives in the different Francophone states, and they do fact-checking. And it's important for these platforms to support and encourage and finance local work for this, so that they have the wherewithal to do something.
Producers are giving me the side eye, but Mariana, did you want a last word before we close?
Yes, I would say that civil society organizations like Mexico Evalúa, we have a role in fighting misinformation. And also, I wanted to share that a view towards the official information from statistical institutions. I think that's key information, and those statistics should be produced under, credible methodologies and professional officials, and they should be independent, these institutions. Maybe in the developed world, this is not something that worries you, but in the developing countries, the authoritarian regimes tend to mess up with these institutions. And those are the primary sources of many of the policy evaluations. So I think a role that think tanks and civil society have to do and embrace is to keep up the good practice in the production of the primary sources. I think that also governments and civil society need to promote the transparency of the information and the analyses. People should be able to evaluate the quality of the information, and providing the information everybody needs to to be open to embrace that. I wouldn't go to the regulation restrictions. I think that is very, very risky, especially in developing countries. That's it. Thank you.
Mariana, thank you. I'm conscious that also that information needs to then be digestible and accessible. People want to engage with it, and I'm struck by a lot of online platforms that are trying to take what you say, but actually trying to incentivize people to come and join, that it isn't just long papers, it's games, it's engagement, and it's trying to get people to spend time in those spaces. Those spaces aren't just for policy think tanks and academics.
Audiences are diverse, and there's a need to make a reach out of them. And that should be something media have to invest and think about it. And also, of course, think tanks and civil society organizations that produce information.
Right. Listen, thank you all for joining us. We are over time, so all I'm going to do to conclude is just, again, to say a huge thank you to the panel. If you can just join me in a round of applause for a spectacular panel. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.